And I certainly, I mean, one of the things that you kind of, uh, allude to as you're going through these historical examples from previous eras, is the way that like there are technologies that we have now that help, whether they're algorithms that we don't, like, technologies that we don't necessarily notice that we're interacting with, or maybe sometimes we do, right? When people are like, oh, why is Google giving me these ads? But we kind
Mhm.
of notice the change in what's being put in front of us digitally, but also I don't know, I do notice certain uh things that I try to use to help my decision making, like I will say I'm a big fan of Wirecutter. Like, also, if I need something kind of
Mhm.
like random or mundane, I will see what does Wirecutter recommend, so I don't have to choose among a million different brand options and that kind of thing. Yeah, so I don't know if that
Right.
resonates with you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in some sense, we all need shortcuts because we live in a world in which we're asked to make choices constantly, and the number of options has proliferated to such a degree that we often can't make our way through the list of things. I mean, from a menu in a Chinese restaurant that lists 180 dishes or something like that, when who's going to read that many? To a worse example would be go to Amazon and try to buy a pair of socks, and I've never put in the word socks, but I imagine one would get thousands of possibilities, and nobody actually wants to pick from among 1,000 pairs of socks. Um, and so we look for ways to, in a sense, constrain our options at this point. This is a very modern predicament, of course, and it's also one of affluent societies where, you know, this is one thing that many people resent about affluent and, one might say, kind of combination democratic capitalist societies where choice is presented to you as the the way into almost any domain except the workplace. I'll put the workplace to the side because that's really a different story in the modern world. But in our so-called free time, free choice is dominant, and we need help with it. And we can get help with things like algorithms that are kind of widely available, though sometimes pernicious in their own way. Or if, wealthy people get help with all kinds of new sorts of experts in choosing. You get a financial planner or a house decorator or a nutritionist, or what are these people? They're all people helping you, in some sense, limit the menu of options. Because choice isn't any decision. Choice is a particular kind of decision in which one has an external menu of some kind, or an imagined menu perhaps, and there are at least two possibilities, but often many more. And one is expected to make a decision based on one's personal preferences.
So maybe we can yeah, maybe thinking what you just said about
Mm.
choice not being, any decision, but in some ways the story that you tell is to say that we've come to a place where we might be, yeah, we might be shaped or formed to think of our lives as a series of decisions rather than, or sorry, as a series of choices, right? Rather than, um, yeah, thinking about decisions I don't know, in thinking in a longer term way, or I don't know, yeah,
Or
or
even
thinking
something
about them
like fate. You could
right,
tell the story of
right,
your existence entirely differently.
right.
It's a very modern predicament. It goes really with the modern novel, which is the realist modern novel is the story of a person who is the architect in some ways of their own existence, but is also buffeted by all kinds of other um, social forces, political forces, cultural forces, but that you can re-narrate our existences the way you're describing as a series of, I decided to move to X city. I chose to major in this subject. This is how we often talk, but that's not a universal.
Right, right. Um, maybe we could stay with the novel and think a little bit too about on the one hand, the kind of conception of the self that emerges from the this, idea of freedom as choice, or freedom in choosing, and the way that in your book, women also play a crucial role. And as you often know, it's typically white women of a higher, middle or upper class kind of socioeconomic status. But they have an important role because of the way that they are choosers in the different realms that you talk about. And we could discuss what those are.
Mhm.
And also they're somewhat vexed in that they're sometimes still limited by the conception of the self that's being kind of philosophized or is coming. Yeah, but I think the novel is one site of that, right? Right. On the one hand have this idea of the self that you just talked about, making decisions that kind of sh shape a life, even if there's also social constraints or social forces that have to be navigated. And also the novel as an important for seeing the kind of interiority of women. So maybe I'll stop talking and have you tell us a little bit more about those two elements working
Yeah.
together in this history.
So thank you for that. The when I started this book, it wasn't really going to be especially about women. Certainly, women were going to be a part of it because I'm always interested in writing about the experience and ideas of people across gender and race and um, every kind of hierarchy and looking where they're common and where they're different. But more and more as I worked on this, I was struck that women play a really interesting role in this history of choice, and that looking at women in particular would help us see both the pros and cons of the development of choice over time, that it would be kind of a way in. And that's because if you go back far enough, the sort of traditional image of choice in Western culture goes back to something called the choice of Hercules. So many of you may be familiar with this. It's an early modern trope. It's everywhere. It's in operas and poetry. It was going to be the Great Seal for the new United States. It's a sort of commonplace. And in it, and when it's visually represented, for instance, it's Hercules standing and deciding whether to do one of two things, the right thing or the wrong thing, virtue or vice. And virtue and vice are usually allegorized as two women, a seductive one and a one who stands for virtue. And what's so interesting there is that that notion of choice starts to be countered as early, I think, as the late 17th into the 18th century by a new one that actually has women at the center. And it's much more like something like commercial choice and eventually even other forms of choice too. But that choice has a woman at the center picking between two things, two male suitors, two ribbons. It can be a variety of different things. And what's interesting is that the two choices have become rather value neutral. They're not, it's not a morally weighted choice. It's the choice, do I like this particular beautiful lace or do I like that particular beautiful lace? And that's where it really starts with women who have access to commercial culture. Gradually, this becomes much wider spread than that, especially as kind of mass produced objects become available across classes. But this newer notion of choice that emerges is kind of coded female from the beginning. And on the one hand, it's very modern. It's where culture's going, and it's noted right away that it's kind of a modern idea. The value, the sort of the preference-driven, value-neutral choice where interior preference rather than what's known to be the right thing to do is what's driving the decision making. On the other hand, though, both shopping, which is a neologism of the 18th century, and women are tainted by this association. And so women are thought to, this is thought to be an inferior form of choice. And I think this story continues. Women are both chastised for their choice making, but women start to aspire to choice making in more domains based on this model of kind of consumer choice or value neutral choice as it becomes clearly a path to success. By the time you get to John Stuart Mill, what he's really saying is that's how you shape a life, is you make choices about your education, about your profession, about politics. And why can't women have those choices too? Can't they learn to be serious choosers? Do they have to be silly choosers like shoppers? And so there's all this kind of ambivalence about choice gave me a way I thought to explore something that lasts to this day, which is the ways in which we hunker after having more choices in more domains. And we're also often aware of the ways in which having access to 1,000 more names and faces on Tinder, say, isn't necessarily going to be the secret to happiness down the line.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Um, and maybe, yeah, I think I'm trying to, there's a few different ways we could go from here. But I think maybe we can address the temporality piece because this is something I'm
Mhm.
particularly excited about. So so on the one hand, even just as you kind of like described, the one of the interventions that you want to make is to show how this history doesn't, it can't really be aggregated around like a specific turning point or a moment, but is it something that's developing over time and kind of fits and starts? But the other thing that's fascinating to me is that the history that you tell about these various cultural practices. So I should just say that the first chapter as about kind of consumer and aesthetic choices. So there's a bit of history of shopping there, but also a history of the novel as a place where we can read about shopping happening. The second chapter is about choosing ideas or beliefs. So there's some histories of the Reformation in there, but also the practice of commonplacing and also reading. We could come back to this, but the idea like of thinking about women's choices in terms of what they're reading, and certainly in this present moment, there's anxieties around what um, kinds of books. I mean, this is a question of censorship as well, right? But like concerns
Mhm.
about what kinds of books are on offer, and whether or not people should even have the option to choose to engage those materials or not. And then the third chapter on romantic choice. So there's a history of dancing, as well as thinking about the kind of history of companionate marriage. And then a chapter on political choice or voting, and thinking about the development of the secret ballot, as well as universal suffrage. And then the last chapter on the science of choice, the development of social sciences and political behavioral sciences, and also standardized testing, which we could refer to. But I want to kind of like lay that out there for some of the folks who might be new to your work. So all of those examples, from one of the things that was exciting for me, is that they show how choice is also not reducible to a single moment of selecting. Sure, maybe sometimes you're going to the grocery store and you want to buy some oranges or something, and you're just pick out the produce that you want. But in a lot of these instances that you described, choice is also about, it becomes an experience, right? So you talk about the kind of architects of choice, the auctioneers or the shopkeepers who are curating an experience of choosing. And so that experience also is temporally expansive. It involves kind of surveying things, judging them, maybe participating in some collective ritual where you're navigating also norms on how to choose, and then like choosing, but it's not kind of reducible to that single moment. So what do you think we should learn from that, or what might be how might that temporality disrupt the way that we think about what freedom is when we think of freedom as kind of freedom to choose?
Yeah, temporality is an interesting concept to introduce here because I think there are sort of two ways in which the story engages in a problem of temporality. One, as you say, is that choosing is not a second. It's not a blip. And that's why the word shopping, for instance, is a neologism of the 18th century, is because it's not the same as just what you described as sort of provisioning, would be going to the store. I need an orange, grab the first orange. They're all the same. I leave. But whether that's a market or a supermarket. But shopping, like most choice making, is a process that begins as an interior process and turns into a behavior and often a kind of ritual. Since we know how to do different kinds of choosing, you choose differently when you go to a restaurant than when you go to a polling place. And yet you understand there's a kind of protocol. And it starts with a kind of some sense in your mind of when confronted with a set of options, what are your preferences? And then we enact something to register that choice. We do something, whether it's pulling the thing, putting it in our basket. Even when you go to Amazon, you still put things in baskets as if we're really in some space. Or you fill out a dance card if you're asking a proper person in the 19th century how to a dance. There are rituals. And I got very interested in trying to understand what you just referred to as experience. And you might think, well, what does experience have to do with intellectual history? But I think it has a lot to do with intellectual history in that I'm really always curious about how ideas and experience intersect without either of them necessarily taking precedent.
Mhm.
So any important philosopher isn't living in a vacuum, right? They're reading other works by philosophers, but they're also living in the world and they're doing things in the world and they're reading everything. You know, if you're in the modern world, you're getting the news or you're whatever you're interacting with. And experience has to inform thought. But then thought and the way it's put into words and the metaphors and the conceptualization and the structures then give often come back and give meaning to experiences we're already having. And I think, you know, I mentioned Mill a moment ago. He's a good example, I think, of somebody who couldn't have made sense outside of Victorian Britain. What he's describing, his conception of what freedom would be, makes no sense outside of a world that hasn't started to have these kinds of practices. But at the same time, Mill was so widely read in the 19th century because he seemed to be able to encapsulize and explain the relationship between things people were doing and aspirational qualities like liberty. So this is I'm answering more than one question here, it seems,
Okay.
but you threw out a lot of different things. There's temporality is important because people are situated in a time and place, and those times and places evolve over time. And temporality matters because choice itself is a process that takes place over time. And I tried to, you know, historians can be maybe rightly accused of often making stories too neat, that they sort of smooth everything into a narrative so that because we do want to tell a kind of story often about the past. But what I think historians can also do is show us the breaks in time, the shifts, the staggered timing across things. And so I tried to both think about time as something that is important in every minute of the book, but also not as a single storyline where everybody kind of lines up and falls into place. And to this day, I think, even as I would say, it's hard to imagine somebody who's not in any way shaped by our choice paradigms today, anywhere in the world. Lots of places in the world are function around resistance to some of these norms, subcultures that focus around resistance to these norms. So at any given moment, we're in more than one space, but we're also in more than one temporality of sorts. So that's a kind of complex, maybe answer to your question, which maybe should have had a more straightforward answer itself. But I think temporality for anybody interested in thought practices is is a very important category. Conversations, even when they sometimes look like we're having a direct conversation with Socrates, we're not really. You know,
Yeah.
we're right. I mean, it's we can engage it with Socrates, but we're operating in different spaces and times, and therefore we're going to see things differently. And for the historian, I think of myself as a kind of intellectual, cultural historian. Those differences matter as much as the similarities.
No, that's all great. And not too much at all to take on. So thank you for yeah, thank you for elaborating that. Thinking what I want, there was some thread that I wanted to pick up and now I've just lost track of it. Oh, I guess yeah, I was thinking I wanted to kind of bring it. So can we go? I mean, one of the joys of reading your work also was well, you know, precisely that kind of nexus of intellectual history and cultural history, but then also
Mhm.
um, as a political theorist and political philosopher and feminist philosopher, that the um, oh my gosh, I just lost track of my thought again. Oh, right. So seeing like part of the pleasure was also like getting to kind of go to do a deeper dive in the historical and then also seeing
Mhm.
where the kind of where you want to approach ethical or normative thinking and where you want to leave room for it, right? So it seems like that's some of what's motivating the project, but then also you're like, and I'm a historian, I'm a historian of the doxic, so I'll think about the you know kind of what we take to be what our assumptions are, which philosophers are also interested in, right? What's the kind of I mean, especially those of us who think about kind of ordinary language,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
What are the kind of commonplace assumptions that we take with us and what's really underlying that. And there are a lot of different ways to investigate this, as you've also been elaborating. But so there are moments where and you can tell me if I'm pushing too much, but where I'm interested in talking with you about like where this leads us in terms of thinking politically. And maybe we can go to your epilogue where you think again about the language of choice, which has become a kind of rallying cry for feminists and others who are uh, in spaces and over discourses of thinking about abortion, who like where choice becomes the kind of like uh, maybe emancipatory language or something like
Mhm.
that. And part of your concern is, especially, post Dobbs, is that that's, like it hasn't delivered, right? And there was even some sense of that among feminists after Roe v. Wade, that this was like not the way to go. To think about the, anti-abortion stance as pro-choice. So one thing, so for as an example, for just um one that is one place I think that that's the kind of temporally complex aspects of choice might be worth, or might be worth bringing it to that um
Mhm. Mhm.
discourse, right? Yeah, to maybe unsettle or disrupt thinking, leaning politically on choice. But maybe
Mhm.
also, I don't know, for you, so for you, is it, do you lean more towards like the temporality would, um, the temporality of choice urges us to kind of abandon choice is in terms of its emancipatory potential, or do you think it might help us just reshape our conception of choice in a more political discourse like
Yeah,
abortion?
thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I will say this. I don't want to be that kind of historian who thinks, what history is really good for? It's the background for everything else. That everybody else can take and have sort of big ideas. The historians sort of fill in what we needed to know to get there. And historians do wonderful work in every field, kind of bringing to light material that we wouldn't otherwise see and telling us about places and times that we wouldn't know about. But often they feel restrained from going where, say, political theorists or philosophers go, which is towards something more normative. And I don't mean normative in the sense of weighing in on a political issue that's a hot button issue right now on one side or the other, because that just produces generally bad scholarship. But I mean normative in the sense of maybe being able to sort of reorient our conversation by shifting the terms in which we're having it at all. And I've decided as a historian that I don't need to be quite as, intellectually timid or modest as to sort of say, like, let somebody else take this and do something with it, that I can try to maybe even tentatively to think about the stakes in what I'm writing and not leave it open-ended. And since I'm the kind of history that I do is really focused on, I would call things that are kind of hidden in plain sight or that taken for granted. You might say, how is that possible? Because these are ubiquitous things like choice. But I think precisely because sometimes we haven't thought about the things that seem to us so natural and so ordinary that we don't need to think about them very much or and certainly not talk about them. When they are given a historicity, when we see how they came about and where they've gone, we get a little bit of distance from them, almost like a kind of travel experience in which you can then come back and reflect and say, huh, that is odd that we do this way, for instance. Or why did we decide to talk about abortion in terms of choice in the 1970s? Why not some other rubric? Now, maybe if we're so used to this decades later, we might not have asked that question except for the fact that it hasn't panned out as well as feminists anticipated in the 70s. So that's so the methodological part. One of my books is about the history of common sense, precisely because it's really the whole category of common sense seemed to me to be in need of a kind of historical view. Why do we take this to be an important category? What have we done with it? How did it get to have the importance it has today? So that was the goal in thinking about choice. And I thought from the beginning, I want to be able to say something about the politics of choice now, not just about how did we get here. Though how did we get here was going to be important for answering that other question. That I see them as interrelated. And so I went back to the material in the 1970s, right after Roe v. Wade was decided. Choice is not really the fundamental category. Privacy is more important in the Roe v. Wade decision itself. But right after the decision, the meeting minutes of the major feminist organizations, and I'm not the only person to have discovered this, are full of discussion of how are we going to actually persuade the public that this shift is going to be a sort of ordinary part of life, that this will be one of the possibilities available. And there's much discussion. Should it be population control? Well, now that seems like a terrible idea, but that was one of the ideas that was certainly floated in the 70s. Should it be a healthcare? In the UK, for instance, there's much more discussion of abortion as a healthcare right. That really didn't go over particularly well in the 70s. There's discussion about ERA and equal rights for women, but that sounded a little too feminist. There were sort of, and one by one, the idea of choice came to seem like probably the most palatable. In other words, who could be opposed? You didn't have to get an abortion. You didn't have to even like the option itself. But all you were saying is what you were saying to people in most other domains. Pick what you like. Pick the thing that matches your preferences. Have a baby, don't have a baby. That's what feminism is having this range of choices. If choice was first choice around suffrage, which I talk about extensively, here's just one more realm in which women could have a fuller set of possibilities and be able to engage in choice in another domain in their lives. Well, it didn't work out as well as expected. The critiques came, and they were both important, from the right and from the left, pretty quickly. And the right one is rather easy sometimes to dismiss as just bad faith, kind of anti-women. But if we look at it another way, it does suggest, doesn't the morality of what you're choosing matter? The counter of the right to life said, this isn't just what you prefer. There's something bigger at stake here. This is a choice with a kind of moral weighting that's as big as who lives and who doesn't. And that critique was a strong one that, as we've seen, has had a very long, successful life on the right side of the spectrum. Farther to the left, especially among Black feminists and radical feminists in the US, came the critique that choice is really, not that impressive a claim unto itself. What is choice if you don't have money to pay for this option, if you don't have time off work for it, if there's no support for having a child, if you want to make this decision one way or another, if there a whole range of possibilities. It made it choice was an abstraction to say you can have this thing, but sorry, you can't actually get a hold of it. So from both sides, the sort of weaknesses of choice, I think, were rather well exposed in the course of the debates we've been having so intensely over the last 50 years about abortion. And of course, we've transferred some of those also now to other gender questions, marriage equality questions, trans rights, a whole range of kind of self-identification questions around choice. In many ways, choice is one of the great liberating ideas of our times. I mean, choice has been important in imagining the importance of autonomous choice has been important in everything from abolitionism to feminism. But choices can work against a range of goals we might think about, places where individual decision making can't bring us collective good, places where choice is a source of anxiety, deciding on a health care plan when you don't know what's going to happen to you in life, and is only it's a sort of torturous process. We blame people for bad choices who've often been in situations in which they've been unable to choose between good options. All of them are bad because they have different situations. And there's a kind of catalog that I could go through, but I wanted to call attention to the places as well in which choice didn't solve our problems, because I think it's more obvious to us in some ways in the ways in which choice is liberating.
Great, great. Okay, maybe as a last question, um, I'll bring up, especially right this, and I think this kind of comes up with the moral questions that are foregrounded in responses to
Mm.
pro-choice stances. That so this the question of like vices that there seems to be with the development of the hegemony of freedom of choice, also a kind of proliferation or at least coming to the foreground, all these vices around choosing. So you name them, yeah, you name them in they, throughout the chapters. They come up early in the shopping chapter. But there's fickleness, right? Like easily changing your mind. There's ambivalence, being two-minded, or kind of split among preferences, or indecisiveness, like not being able to make a decision at all. And then there's also superficiality, caring too much about appearances, or impulsiveness, to choosing too quickly, or pickiness, being hard to please, or the question of like frivolity, like you're choosing what doesn't really matter. And so it kind of one of the concerns about choice too is that it maybe even introduces the vice that we like stop caring about the really important decisions or the really important moral actions or something like that. So these choices, you mentioned the Hercules choice and that trope. But one of the things that changes, as you also mentioned, is not just a choice between right and wrong, but where you have kind of value neutral choices. But some of these vices are really less about what it is you're choosing and more about the how, right? If the vice is choosing too quickly or taking your time or not being able to decide. And you also mentioned that so there's a kind of moralizing that happens, but there are also feminized vices. Often just or like a lot of these words are words that we are kind of like negative stereotypes of
Mhm.
feminine subjects. So how might you? I mean, I think of like Sarah Ahmed as someone who tries to trace some of the um, or tries to rethink some of these. She doesn't necessarily use the word vices, but thinking about willfulness, which is also a kind of like going again, like choosing that, like I'm going to do it my way, even in the face of some kind of authority saying no, you're going against the kind of what's expected of you or of a general will. And then also impulsiveness and thinking about feminine, which she calls feminist snap, and saying, well, impulsiveness, that moment of snap usually actually has a history. It's not just about being rash. So those are some of the ways I think of like the kind of afterlives of these vices, but I'm wondering how they've shown up either in your historical research or we might want to rethink them or what to kind of do with them going forward.
Right. So, if you read, some of you have probably been read behavioral economists who kind of make a big deal out of discovering that we're not rational choice choosers after all. And, that we don't always know our minds. More information doesn't always get us to the right choice, that we're not consistent over time. And this is made quite a big deal of in response to economists thinking about the chooser and really only for theoretical purposes, but as a rational choice chooser. And of course, if you looked at literature, or if you looked at really sort of any other cultural products from probably the 18th century onwards, you'd see that the idea that we're not good choosers is no revelation of the late 20th century. Almost every great novel is about somebody making a choice that they either regret or somebody else regrets, or that doesn't pan out the way it's expected, or is too rash, or as you say, and often that heroine is female, right? Many of the great, and sometimes written by women, but often from, Tolstoy to Flaubert to Dickens, you will find, right, in the stories of women who are done in by their choices in various ways. And you're right, often the choices can be described as they're impetuous, they're vain, they can't think through what they need in the long run. And choice itself can be moralized in this way. And one of the reasons I was so interested in this shift to the value neutral, the modern, say, the shopper as a type, is the ways it's given kind of these modern valences. The supermarket shopper is the modern person, but always with this suggestion that there's something sort of both morally and epistemologically amiss about what that person is doing. And those things, as you say, have a female valence always. And I think to come back to the abortion debate, when critics say things like women just want abortion on demand, there's a kind of resonance there that goes all the way back to that 18th century shopper to say something like, you know, this is a frivolous decision you're making. You just want something when you want it. You haven't thought through the implications and the deep moral significance of what you're doing. And so I see that as a kind of through story in all of this. And one of the sort of tensions in the whole book is about how choice comes to dominate both our political lives and our sort of socioeconomic existences. And yet we're all deeply aware of the limits of choice and the flaws in our ability to do it on any way that produces results that we ultimately are happy with, individually or collectively. We're constantly, people are in, they buy too much, they're in debt, they buy stupid things they don't want, they vote for bad candidates for office. We critique the way we choose all the time.
I'm going to move to some questions from the audience now, which I'm looking
Great.
at in the Q&A function. But I also just want to just yeah put or note that like yeah we didn't get to the behavioral scientists or the social scientists, but like that struck a chord and was there was a kind of deep pleasure to it reading
Oh, good.
as someone who had who was a humanities who's in the humanities who came to political science and was like what if I felt some disorientation around like what is this and how, yeah, I think, well, and also, all, on a, yeah, slightly more serious note, I think that thinking still really, really shapes the field and the way that questions are asked, um,
Mhm.
for
I
inquiry.
agree.
So yeah, that and whatever, that's a longer conversation we could have some other time. But I'm gonna share a question from D. Smith, who asks, "What is the relationship between creativity and freedom, particularly in the past?" The Middle Ages or ancient world, for example, which isn't your time period, but maybe you have some thoughts. They were very creative, but often in a bounded way. So, how is creativity now different in its relation to freedom versus then?
What a wonderful question about creativity. Some people would say that choice itself is in a sense an anti-creative idea because you have to start with a menu of options that you didn't create. Now, of course, there are wonderful modernists who come up with ways around that. Collage, for instance, takes the existing materials and creates something entirely new with them that nobody creating those materials anticipated. Marcel Duchamp had a lot of really interesting ways of thinking about how you could transcend kind of choosing from the options out there. And I think it's been bypassing choice has been a source of creativity in the modern world. But of course, we think about creativity very differently than did the ancients, who saw creativity as bound up in mimesis to a much greater degree than in the modern era, in which um, originality was not as much the question as how to create a more perfect, more beautiful representation of the world that we're in, which again wasn't so much about choice, but about what was given. Choice as the problem of creativity, I think, is a more modern condition in many ways. And it's one that has prompted both investigation of its mechanisms on the part of many artists, visual and literary, and also a kind of fascinating array of attempts to transcend choice. I found in this regard, I found Duchamp particularly interesting. Could he create kind of desire that doesn't work the way a storefront window does, showing you goods that you feel you have to pick from? And what would a work of art that represented that look like? So, yes, anybody thinking about creativity has to, in a sense, get muck in the waters of thinking about choice.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And that was a great question. Okay, next we have a question from Kaleem. So a few questions. I think I'm just gonna choose one. So this is, hi, really enjoying your talk. You highlight the parallel rise of shopping and religious freedom in the early modern period as key moments in the invention of choice in the West. Could you speak to specific mechanisms or societal shifts that facilitated this convergence? Do you mean the emergence of the free market or something else?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. The person who asked this question, I haven't said much about sort of causation. What's behind this? Why does the world go this way? And I do see some very big structural reasons. They're sort of at the center of the book, but several things happen to make this world of choice possible. One is how Western Europe becomes enmeshed in a colonial world where the array of goods and experiences proliferates so that a kind of pluralism exists even in the world of something as mundane as fabric that hadn't existed before. And that, of course, depends on both colonial powers, like Britain and France expanding empires. Slavery, yes, is part of this story in an important way, both slavery and abolition, and urbanization, because the culture of material goods for sale in particular ways is very tied to the growth of cities and anonymity and the experience of urban life. So that's one part of it. And you pointed to another just now. The other is the pluralization of religious culture in Europe. It's a kind of accidental aftermath of the Reformation, quite separate from this colonial question and urbanization, that produces decades, centuries of warfare. But once the warfare is eventually over, the idea that people are going to have to live with their neighbors produces the possibility of imagining intellectual pluralism as well. And that becomes secular as well as religious. New notions of even freedom of speech start to emerge in this context. So that variety and pluralism and the way that they start to haunt the spaces of Europe and then the extra-European world is really crucial to this story. That we could eventually get to the ways that globalization spreads this paradigm in very different forms all over the globe. Already in the 19th century, for instance, by the time I get to talking about social dancing, we can talk about St. Petersburg and Santiago, and Prague at the same time, which sound like in Chicago. And so it tells you something about the kind of spread of these ideas. And today, the culture of shopping, for instance, touches most of the globe in one form or another.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to take a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, I wonder if you could comment about commitment and ongoing repeated choices in contrast with these single, maybe ritualized moments of choice we often think of. I feel the commitment choices are more neglected in comparison in my UK culture.
So, I don't want to suggest that we choose everything the same way. I mean, you don't go to the store and pick that orange that you referred to for the same way you're going to pick a spouse. That's just, or, a long-term partner. That's just not how we operate. And in some ways, it's silly that we call them both choices because they have such different meanings and we make them on different grounds. And some choices are meant to be made once. And some, as you say, and some are repeat choices we have to make every day. Do I take the bus or do I walk? Kind of thing. Um, on the choices that are the sort of the big, important choices, even there, something though interesting has happened over time. We've given ourselves escape valves that allow for choosing again. And I know, Isabel, you work on relationships and divorce and this sort of question. Divorce is kind of like a returns department in a department store. It sort of says if you absolutely regret this choice, there may be the possibility of a way out so that you can make another one. Not so that you give up choice indefinitely, but that you can do this again. And so, though I am interested in the different ways we make choices across different realms, politics too, we get a redo every few years. The redo is part of the modern choice culture, which says there's always some space here to reconsider and make a new choice and try to better the situation, whether that's the political situation or your marital happiness. I think, so I've been trying to sort of look at the ritual choices we make every day, but also the ways in which we embed even the big choices into various kinds of processes that are kind of ordinary parts of life right now too. I hope that answers that question.
I think that's great. I'll just like maybe as a 2 cents add on. One
Mm.
of the things that interested in thinking about right now too, and this it kind of relates to meta choices or choices about the choices that we make about choices, like choosing where to
Mhm.
shop or where to go out
Mhm.
to eat or something. But in the US, there's a few states that have what they call covenant marriages, which is when you can kind of choose to enter a marriage contract or choose to get married, but you rescind like being able to divorce on the grounds of incompatibility. So you can still divorce, but under some very kind of strict parameters that really have to do with like abandonment, and serious abuse and criminality. But um, right, but you can't divorce on the grounds of incompatibility. So it's a kind of
Yeah.
way of pushing back against no fault divorce. It's really just given as an option right now. Some states are trying to make it incentivized, like so you get a tax incentive to have a covenant marriage.
Interesting.
But it's there's something about okay, so the swing back to like I think the kind of traditionalist concern about choice of like there always being a way out. That is, I think, one of the traditionalist concerns about choice, and so that it's like well, let's create a measure for you to choose to not have a way out. That's how I think, at least, think about covenant
It's the
marriage.
antithesis of the prenup or something like that, which
Yeah.
sets up the conditions for when the choice is no longer valid, which is more like a contract, a work contract, which kind of says these are the things that's going to be required of you, but either of you can break this contract with some rules attached to it. Yeah, that's fascinating about covenant marriage. It's almost like, things that we need to tie ourselves down because our culture is lets us too quickly flip from this to that to the other thing.
Do we have time for one more question, maybe?
Sure.
Okay. So this is another question from Kaleem. I wonder how you think of concepts of choice in non-European cultures, how they, right, choice in non-European cultures emerged, and how any of them are different to models of the West.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful question. And, I'm not competent to tell you about the history of every part of the globe. And I do hope, one of my great hopes for the book would be that somebody would take up some of these ideas and investigate them in cultures in which I have less kind of cultural access and linguistic access. What does this mean in a place like China, which has a flourishing commercial culture at this point, but does not have the political culture that values choice in the same way? What do these ideas mean? One thing I'm struck, the way I've gotten at this myself is sometimes by reading world literature. Some of the great novels written today outside the Western context actually take up what happens when the kinds of choice we associate often with, especially with the US, but with the West, let's just to give it a kind of crude category, come to places where, for instance, families have thought of themselves operating as single units, but now different family members are pursuing different goals in different directions, and the disintegration of certain norms. Um, but insofar as globalization has touched so much of the world, notions, almost everywhere in the world there's elections now, even places we would call very autocratic. A commercial culture, even of used goods in some of the poorest parts of the world, brings Western style products and their multiplicity to much of the world, along with, all the kind of environmentally terrible practices that go with that. It's hard to not be touched by this. You'd have to live in a very, very obscure part of the world. But these values are entering societies. They're often structured in very different ways that, for instance, don't tell stories about families, about individual lives around, I decide to do this and then this, and I chose that and I chose this. And I think the global novel has become the place where you can see the intersection of those things in particularly eye-opening ways. That and travel, of course, which lets you sort of see, similarly to history, what's familiar and what's not. And then, and again, does the same thing of sort of denaturalize some of our um, biases towards this being the only way we can construct what humans are supposed to be doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. We're right about at time. I think maybe if I can briefly ask, along the lines of the kind of hidden in plain sight or the
Mhm.
commonsensical, what's next for you? Do you have a sense of what?
Ah, good question. I wish I could tell you exactly what for now, I'm still talking about choice, but I like my projects to come out of the moment. Though I like to go deep into history, I like to think about how we're living now and what we're doing that we aren't talking about. And I
Mm,
feel that we're in a moment that's in very many ways extraordinary in the US in the last 4 months at least has become the pace of change seems rather radical to me. I don't know whether it will look the same in a year or not, but I'd like to try to figure out the sort of some of the driving ideas in this moment. In some ways, choice is the dominant idea of kind of liberal norms. Will choice remain that? I'm not sure. And if not, what will replace it? I hope to be the kind of historian that can illuminate the present by going back to the past. And I feel like I don't really have enough grasp on what's happening right now. It's a little destabilizing to be sure that I take up the right thing.